Good morning, world. I am Holly Sindel coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Today we're going to look at Boomer to Zoomer, a generational reflection. I'm going to start with saying recording a session versus doing this in person is certainly much more difficult, as I had many takes on which I wanted to just toss it out. But here it goes. I'm at the end, one and done. So apologize for any pauses as that may come up. So let's get going. My bio's in the summary here that you can log in online, so I'm not going to spend the time reintroducing myself. But actually, I'll tell you a little bit of a few other things about me and how it ties to this topic. I'm a boomer at the twilight of my career, and I wish I had the resources like this conference and the support and networks that have developed for women in construction over the last 10 to 15 years when I was first starting in the industry. I didn't talk about being a woman in construction for probably the first 25 years of my career. Everyone knew I was different. I was one of the only women in the organization I was working for. So why point it out? And when I did get involved in the discussion, for the first time in my life, I needed to pause and think, am I a feminist? I am a baby boomer. Early feminist organizations were not what they are today. Although they all had the same goal, organized activity on behalf of women's rights and interests, the approach was different. We are all here today as feminists. Women in Construction Online Festival, doesn't that fit the definition? So why was I a late bloomer? Because I did not grow up with gender bias as a child in my home. So let me connect some of the dots here on women in construction and how we tie the generational perspective to this conversation. From baby boomers to Gen X, we have skirted the conversation on bias. It was called chauvinism early in my day, and on the job site, people weren't concerned about showing their chauvinism. Conversations morphed just as Gen Y seemed to arrive on the projects, and political correctness became more of a thing. And so you didn't really talk about it, but you really didn't see things changing. So you weren't asked to take notes, and you weren't asked to make the coffee, but you were not advanced as rapidly either. Now we have the Zoomers, and guess what? They demand diversity, inclusion. Gender is not a definer, and they really don't put a whole lot of labels on gender items. So what is the construction industry going to do with this demand, and how will they address a slow change in diversity? When I started in 1986, I think women were probably around the 1% level. In 2020, we are above 9, but below 10%, and it has been in the 9s for probably the last 10 years. That is a slow change. And why is it important? We need role models, and we all need to unite for advancement, development, and inclusion of women in construction. And we will bring an impact to the bottom line. By 2025, 75% of the global workforce will be millennials and Generation Z. So you have teams that you don't understand, you need to figure them out. And for those up and coming, you need to recognize that old is not bad. And although it might be different, you need to understand why it is different and learn and leverage the offering. So who are the generations? You know, the people who are probably mid to late 50s to early 70s, those are the boomers. Generation X, those are the 40 to 55-year-olds. Millennials, the 24 to 39-year-olds. And Gen Z, those just hitting the job site now, and they're in their early 20s, and they'll just be starting to fill up our workforce. So who you are is constructed by your environment, your experiences, and your genetics, but we won't talk about the genetic aspect of that. So let's look at some key traits that are the drivers for each generation, because leveraging needs to start with understanding. So what were some of the cultural items that were happening during this generation? Boomers, we're talking sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And color TV came in during our childhoods. I remember our first color TV, and it probably took the whole family to carry it in from the house, and it was only an 18-inch. Generation X, MTV came, and that was something totally new to watch on TV. The millennials, they've always had mobile technology, and Gen Z, they've lived with mobile technology, they've lived with handhelds, but now they're a big concern, and something driving it is global warming. Our attitude on work and career have differed from the boomers looking to have work as expected. Millennials, it was a means to an end. Zoomers is constantly evolving. So what are our drivers? Boomers wanted job security. X brought the conversation about work-life balance to the workplace. Millennials, freedom and flexibility. And Z, back to job security and stability, but in a different aspect than the boomers in that they are not tied to an employer to give that to them. They're looking for that in general. And we look at how we communicate. Think about how this has changed over the last 40 years. All my conversations were on the phone or in person during my early time on the job sites. I had a secretary, and they were called secretaries, not administrative assistants, and they answered the phone. And when I came back from a meeting, I had a stack of phone messages on my desk that they had taken and left for me so I could call people back. Email then arrived next, and the millennials have lived on communicating through social media. Gen Z have had a handheld since they were born. I wonder if they've used a payphone. I chose between a computer and a copy machine on my first job site. Took the copier. Why? Because I had the secretary who typed my letter, so the computer wasn't necessarily as important. And you did type a letter, and you then typed it on something called letterhead. That was special paper. Because at the time, everything was a dot matrix printer. Didn't look as nice as your typewriter. And of course, it had the perforated edges along the side. So if you did use it, you then had to use the copy machine to put the letter on the letterhead so you could have a wet signature. You know, now I just kind of paste it on and have it in my toolbox on Bluebeam. So a car was also a big thing when I was a teen. Got my license on my birthday, and my birthday is Christmas Eve. My granddaughters have had phones since they were probably 11 years old. And although they have gotten their licenses when they can, many friends don't, and they just call Uber. Has a Zoomer ever written a check? Or how about a letter that you actually put in the mail? My mom sent me a letter once a week when I was away at school, and I called home once a month, as a long-distance call was a luxury. Gen X might remember when roaming on your cell phone cost more money. Y and Z generation probably gauge their cell phones by data plans, not on the distance you are calling to. And all of this, your experience develop us, and then we arrive at our employer in our workplace. I am a generation where my career was defined by the employer. I stayed at my first job for 20 years. Gen X was loyal to their professions and not their employer. Millennials worked with and not for, and worked to live and not vice versa. And the Zoomers look to multitask, move between organizations and types of businesses. You look at this opportunity, an aspect of our industry that is centered on the disruptors, the technology that is leveraging construction professionals. The Zoomers are filling those roles. If you were a boomer or Gen X, you thought the early millennials as lacking loyalty, but it was really the mindset of career flexibility and freedom, and a bit of change where the Zoomers look for security and stability, a key as they have known an economic downturn. and not necessarily singularity in the industry or who they work for. So let's talk a minute about disruptors in training. Technology has increased the demand for construction professionals. I remember in 2010 or so, when I heard of a young engineer leaving to go work for a tech company, I scratched my head and I thought, why? 10 years later, we know why, with the interface and fingertip access to our built world. This area is vast and growing, but the need to make it truly a game changer comes from the tech world gaining knowledge in the build. So not only do you need to stay current on all of the new bells and whistles that your younger workforce demands, but you need to also worry that companies that only build in the virtual world is a threat to your talent, and a threat once you have invested and trained them. Let's look back at training. For the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a concern about the baby boomers retiring and that this would be a void of knowledge, especially in the superintendent side. The construction sites in the 80s, 90s, and even start of 2000 had many superintendents who came up from the trades, apprentice, journeyman, foreman, GF, and then the jump to management. Now there's a desire from college path professionals to go that route. So how do you train? And this is where I believe the youngest two generations have done an exceptional job. In spite of the grumpy response from the old guy on the job site about keeping up paper drawings, etc., the transition to electronics and electronic plan rooms has been a game changer. And it's been a game changer even in the early days when it was just the PDF reader-writer. And this is the Y generation, finding the way to communicate and demonstrate that technology can be fun and easy and make your life better. Maybe 7 years ago, I completed a large design build project where the team efficiency, the concepts of lean, organically happened. I was asked to look at that and to break it down so that it could be used on other projects. That led to a presentation at LCI conference called Evolution of the Construction Dinosaur. And at that point, I think I had a huge learning moment where I recognized that technology does not get my adrenaline up. Not like going to a job site and seeing the crane swing a beam in place and the iron worker at the top of the column putting in those first bolts. But the benefit of listening and hearing of changes that can happen from those just entering our industry and how this was going to be a return and an advantage. And that I might not have the curiosity to be looking at that next techie item myself, but I better have that techie thrilled person on my team who would be constantly at my door to tell me the new and exciting things to make us more efficient. And I better find a way to fund it. And I needed to understand that not everyone on my team was going to bring the same return on efficiency on the actual work, but the importance of what they were interested in and what were their drivers and triggers to make them exceptional needed to be recognized and exploited. Our world is changing, and if you are not embracing the change, you will be left behind. And if you are driving the change in technology, don't discount the importance that the experience of those who have done it bring, and how doing it differently does not mean it is not going to work. The experience of the older generations gives you the lessons learned, and these lessons don't need to be learned again just because we're learning it in the virtual world. We take advantage of everything in the technology world. A really big one at this point is 3D, the project model. A light table is probably something that's in a museum where we did 2D overlays. They were probably done by hand in your conference room. And this went on until early part of the century. The early conversations were around the cost of BIM. Now you cannot afford to not do it. So now let's talk about walking in their shoes. As I stated earlier, in 5 years, 75% of the workforce will be millennials and Zoomers. There is a difference in expectation. Although the end result of building a project is the same, beams are welded, screws and wooden studs, the approach is changing. Prefabrication, holograms for layout, a lot of new technologies to be used. But besides just the built side, there are the other sides like diversity and inclusion. The expectations of Generation Z is that you will have diversity and everyone will be included. And to talk the talk, but not walk the talk, will not make you a leader of choice or an employer of choice. In 2013, I, along with a group of exceptional women in construction, started an organization and we called it YOPS. And it was for mentoring of women in construction operations. We joked that our goal was to become irrelevant in the years ahead. Zoomers, men, women, neutral, non-binary, trans, I look to you to accelerate the percentage of diverse talent in the industry. And in doing so, leverage the women in the boomer and X generations and look to understand the energy and time that they have had to expend in their career to make it. Not only did the women of earlier generations need to make the coffee and take the notes, but they also needed to find a way to not hurt feelings or to be apparently too good at their jobs. Not many women in my generation wanted to be the smartest girl in math class. Understand what makes your team click. What are their drivers? And understand how their approach and path probably is sitting next to them and is in your conversation. I used punch cards to code my first computer program, dropped them off at a computer center to run, and a few hours later returned in the hopes I had an answer and not an error. Things are not always immediate in my decision making, and I tend to be a little bit more methodical and analytical. Measure twice, cut once. But that processing changes with computers and technology, where you change one number and hit the calculate button to see the result. I learned to do scheduling and CPM by hand, forward path, backward path. Now, using a program, I think it's you hit F9 and you immediately can have a 10,000 activity give you an answer on what your critical path is. So think about all of these differences when you think that there is a lack of understanding. And if you have someone who corrects or offers suggestions that appear critical, ask the question of, well, why? And don't just assume that they're being a micromanager. It could be they see high potential in you and you are selling yourself short. They are learning to communicate with you and maybe don't always deliver in 5-word conversations that you are more comfortable with, but understand what gives them also the comfort as you're both learning to communicate. So walk in their shoes and offer them yours with curiosity and understanding how our experiences, our cultures, our current events of our times have made us communicate and interface the way we do. We all have the same end goal, get the projects built, because we are women in construction. Thank you.